Good evening and welcome to the webinar of the SAIEE Load Research Chapter. My name is Wiebke Toussaint. I will be presenting on shedding light on residential energy consumer behaviour in South Africa. The presentation is based on my master's research, which I did at the Department of Computer Science at UCT and which was funded by the Centre for Artificial Intelligence Research. The presentation has two primary objectives. Firstly, it's to demonstrate how artificial intelligence can help advance and broaden load research as it's been done in South Africa so far. And secondly, it's to highlight and demonstrate a really great new data or old data set but new in the sense that it's been recently released within a collaboration of various different stakeholders, including Eskom, Marcus Dierkenaar, UCT, Stellenbosch, CSR. And so I hope to show what can be done with a study like that. So to get started, here's an overview of the presentation. I'll initiate by starting with the context and definitions. I'll introduce the problem statement that I worked at solving. I'll give insights into the data that we've been working with. Then we will dive into the meatier bits, and I'll present the framework for creating customer archetypes and approaches for load profile clustering, as well as cluster classification and customer segmentation. The presentation as a whole is quite technical. I've put in a lot of images and little text, so hopefully you'll stay awake and can follow. And I'm quite aware that many of you may not be familiar with some of the techniques that I'm presenting, so I've made sure to explain them in simple terms and sometimes spend a bit more time going into the theory so that you can get an insight of how the mechanics of my work actually come about. To contextualize energy consumers, household electrification in South Africa is a great success story. So over the last 25 years, over 50% of the country has been electrified. In order to do that, data was collected to get fine-grained information about consumer behavior in the country. One of the challenges that we sit with in South Africa is that our population is highly diverse and highly dynamic. Diverse means that you have a great variety of different types of people, different types of climatic zones, different habits that come with different cultures. And dynamic meaning that people don't always stay people's behavior changes a lot because their circumstances changing a lot. So South African population is dynamic in terms of movement, it's dynamic in terms of economic mobility, it's dynamic in terms of geography. In wealthier areas, in particular, there's been a shift to renewables amongst high-income urban consumers, which is presenting quite a challenge to municipalities. In low-income areas, again, there's been increasing questions around whether some of the gains that we've seen through electrification are starting to maybe be less evident as low-income consumers are struggling to pay for their electricity bills. And energy poverty is becoming a reality again in certain parts of South Africa. So all of these trends, all of these questions require us to have customer insights, which we need in order to be able to do effective long-term energy planning to continue provisioning South African households with the energy that they need to do the things that they want. If we think of energy consumer behavior, we express it with a load profile. So a load profile is a 24-hour graph or a 24-hour time series that shows at different time intervals how much energy or how much current a particular household consumed. A load profile can be aggregated over different time intervals. It could be 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 1 hour. And it depends a lot on the measuring frequency of your measurement device. What you see on the left here is a daily load profile, which is typically the timestamp of a single household. And you can think of that very much as the fingerprint of that household. It shows which appliances have been switched on when and when. Which appliances have been switched on when. Or how many appliances, maybe how much energy was consumed. What you see on the right is a representative daily load profile. So as you'll see, that curve is a lot smoother. And it represents an average over several daily load profiles. And that average can be taken either across households, so taking, for example, a representative daily load profile at a particular location for a group of households, or it could be a representative daily load profile for a single household taken over a set of days. But the representative daily load profile always is a smoothing of the actual daily load profile. If we speak of a customer archetype effectively is a collection of load profiles that represents consumers that share common attributes. And so, for example, we might wish to group consumers living in a particular geography, like the Free State, and we might want to have different representative daily load profiles for summer and winter, because we think that energy consumption might be different in those two. And we might also want to have different representative daily load profiles on weekdays versus Saturdays and Sundays. So a customer archetype would then be that collection of load profiles for a consumer in the Free State. And again, then you might say, well, not all consumers are the same. We wish to separate rural from urban. So a rural consumer in the Free State, that collection of load profiles that represents the consumption behavior in summer and winter and on different day types. And ultimately, the reason why we want these kind of archetypes is because it means that we don't need to know how 57 million people consume energy, but instead we can have 10 or 15 representative archetypes that make modeling decisions much easier. So if we think about where we need this kind of consumer modeling, I would like us to zoom out and remember that the energy industry energy services industry is a business. And like all businesses, it's got costs, it's got revenue. And any business is only as useful as in order for a business to serve its customers, it needs to understand who those customers are. And understanding consumer behavior within the energy space, understanding load profiles and understanding representative load profiles and customer archetypes is ultimately a way of gaining insight into the kind of consumer that the energy services industry is serving. So if we look at the energy services industry business model, we've got cost, which is like things of cost, which is, you can think of as the product, and revenue generation activities, which relates to the customer. If we think of energy sales as being one of the major contributors towards, what should be the major contributor towards revenue generation, we could use consumer modeling to get better insights or make better decisions related to pricing and tariff development. We could use consumer modeling and customer archetypes for marketing strategies. And if we then look at supply side and demand management, so understanding how we nudge consumers to consume energy in a way that helps the energy services industry to better operate its facilities. So the field of demand side management requires insight into what the demand is and how energy users use energy. Then on the supply side, it would be looking at generation capacity planning and network planning and design. So what's important in that within those, so if the areas in bold are some of the major applications of load modeling. So generation capacity planning, network planning and design, pricing, marketing strategies and demand side management. Those 5 areas won't necessarily require the same customer archetypes. So depending on application, you may be interested in very different ways of aggregating your consumers. In network planning and design, you might not care so much whether your consumers have similar behavioral attributes. You care if your consumers feed to the same substation. Whereas in demand side management, you might not actually care about or you might, in demand-side management, you might care about the likelihood that a consumer is willing to switch off their appliances at a particular time of day, and you really don't care where they live. And in terms of marketing, it might be similar. You're looking for consumers that behave in particular ways and are less concerned about their geography or potentially other attributes. So in the work that I did in particular, we were looking at customer archetypes for long-term energy planning. And in particular, the question was whether we can automate the generation and evaluation of residential energy consumer archetypes for long-term planning. Long-term planning is typically the kind of modeling that you need to plan your future infrastructure. So you're looking 10, 20 years into the future, if not further. And you really want some degree of nuance of who your consumer might be, but because the future is so uncertain, there's a lot of discrepancy in terms of what that might look like. And in energy modeling in the past, quite often the consumers that have been modeled have been very, very rough profiles of just a low income and a high income consumer. And the question was really whether we can create a more nuanced view of what an energy consumer is in order to inform long-term models. The data that we used is the domestic electrical load study data. As mentioned in my introduction, this is a data set that has been recently released at DataFirst for academic research use. It's a fantastic study that has been collected by a very large variety of stakeholders since 1994. The data that is available at DataFirst is a subset from 1994 to 2014. And this is really a lot of so the study, the domestic electrical load study data has informed a lot of decisions made within the energy services industry over the past 2 decades, but it has typically been quite difficult for research collaborators to access the data. And now with it being at DataFirst, we're looking forward to really great new research emerging from South African universities and research institutions. So if this data seems of interest to you, then definitely head over to DataFirst and take a look. I'll now go through a couple of slides to explain or to describe the population in the data set. The geographic distribution of the population is shown on the map. You'll see the bigger the dot, the longer data was collected at a particular site. The red dots show that the data collection at a site started longer ago, whereas the green dots show that the data collection started more recently. So, as you can see from that, care was taken to collect household energy consumption data from east to west, north to south, rural, urban, all across South Africa. Over a 20-year time span, which is really unique as far as access as access to data that can give insights of energy consumption is concerned, actually on a global level. The data was collected primarily by municipalities and by Eskom, and was sorry. So the data was collected primarily by municipalities and by Eskom, and it was collected in 2 forms. So the study connected a household to a data logger that collected the actual energy consumption, so in the current, voltage and power information of that household over a 1-year time span. And that data was collected at 5-minute intervals. And that's what I term the metered energy data. And then together with that metering, once a year, a survey was done where certain socio-demographic and dwelling attributes about the household were collected in a door-to-door survey. So the numbers of metered households and surveys don't correspond entirely, which is why we've got these 2 graphs. On the left, with the metered households, you can see the number of households that were metered from 1994 to 2014. And on the right, you see the number of households that were surveyed from 1994 to 2014. And in 2007 and 2013, no household surveys are available for those years. And just from the graph, it's also shown that the municipalities initially contributed a lot, both to metering and survey collection. The municipalities are the bars in red, and ESCOM then took over both with metering and data collection over the past couple of years. This graph just shows again that the actual data that was collected is not continuous. This shows on a daily level how many households were observed from 1994 to 2014. So you can see two big spikes of about 1,200, which was the maximum, or three big spikes, which was the maximum number of households observed. And then you can see that there was one day in about 2011 or so where some data must have been lost or some mistake must have happened and no households were observed. So if we look at the data, it's not a continuum. There's real life discrepancies that happen. The type of consumers, or the type of households that were monitored, this histogram shows the average daily consumption per household over the 20 years. So the majority of households, a third of households had an average daily consumption of less than 5 kilowatt hours, and over half of the households surveyed had an average daily consumption with less than 10 kilowatt hours. What is important to note here is that, and then from this particular histogram only goes to 100 kilowatt hours. It's cut off some of the tail end of very high consumers, because it just becomes ugly then. What is important to note here is that removing the very high consuming outliers, or the very high consuming households, is not a good thing to do, as they contribute disproportionately towards total energy consumption. So even though they make the analysis challenging, it's important to keep them in the data set. The characteristics of the population in the DEL data set is that, so here we've got three donut charts that look at the water access and then the dwelling materials, but like roof materials and wall materials of respondents. So a fair number of households that don't have access to water in the house, a fair number of households that have corrugated iron zinc roofs and informal settlements, and quite a lot of households in traditional dwellings with mud and clay houses. Again, it's important to note that this was done. Some of these characteristics were very relevant 20-25 years ago, and as time is changing, not all rural households might look the way that they looked 10, 15 years ago. And of course, as household characteristics and people's aspirations change, so does the need for electricity, which is exactly why understanding customer behavior is important. Now moving on to the actual meaty bits of how to create customer archetypes. Here's the very high-level structure of the process that we did. The framework for creating archetypes involved three processing steps. First is load profile clustering, the second is cluster classification, and the third is customer segmentation. Load profile clustering requires hourly load profiles, and then the cluster classification uses the socio-demographic survey data in order to characterize the clusters. Don't get worried about this yet, you'll understand it as we move along. So what is clustering? Cluster analysis is an unsupervised machine learning technique. And machine learning as a field is concerned with programming computers to automate the process of converting observational data into an output that learns from the input data. Machine learning itself has been around for several decades. It's, over the last couple of years, had a massive revival, primarily because the amounts of data that are available now are unprecedented. And we're now living in an era where machine learning techniques can be tried on many interesting new data sets. If we look at unsupervised machine learning in particular, the goal of unsupervised machine learning is to discover structure in the input data in the absence of training labels. So machine learning, you get supervised and unsupervised machine learning. Supervised machine learning, you would know what a data point is, or you'd know what category it belongs to. In unsupervised machine learning, you don't, and you're looking for patterns within that data. Now, sounds really nice, but there's a caveat, which is that machine learning or clustering algorithms are designed to make clusters. So one of the lesser noted, very obvious truths is that if you give a clustering algorithm a data set, no matter whether there are patterns in there or not, it will find clusters because that's what it's made to do. And so, for example, if we've got these 4 circles here, you think simple, how do we cluster them? Of course, like this. Seems very obvious. However, that's not the only way in which we can cluster those 4 circles. You can just as well cluster them like this. And ultimately, if I ask you which of the two is correct, it's really hard to tell, because it might depend on many different things, whether you want to cluster by gender or whether you want to cluster by profession, if these 4 dots represented people, whether you want to cluster by height or whether you want to cluster by country of birth. So the features on which you cluster ultimately shape the clusters that you get. And cluster analysis inherently is subjective and driven by the assumptions of the designers of the models. This means that evaluation of clustering is incredibly important, and I will spend some time, or as we move through the framework, we will discuss cluster evaluation further. So let's look at load profile clustering within this framework. Here's a quick overview, and this is so starting in the top left corner with the data input. We'll be discussing data input, then we'll be discussing pre-processing steps for the clustering. We'll discuss the actual time series clustering algorithms and experiment setup. Then I'll take you through the quantitative evaluation metrics that we used, construction of representative daily load profiles. I think we'll skip that. And then we'll finally discuss an additional set of qualitative evaluation measures that we use to get better representative daily load profiles at the end. The clustering input for our project were electrical current readings at 5-minute cadence that we averaged over 1 hour. Altogether, we had over 3 million daily load profiles representing 14,945 household years. What is important to note, these aren't unique households. These are households that were monitored over 1 year. So it's a yearly time frame over which that household was monitored. On average, households were observed for about 220 days within that yearly period, and 61% of households were observed for more than half a year. At most, 1,245 households were observed on a single day. Normalization is important for clustering. The way clustering algorithms work is by minimizing the distance between clusters, between data points that are similar. So understanding how to measure distance and optimizing or reducing that distance to a particular point is really what clustering algorithms do. So normalization is important because it brings all data points into a common range. In the literature within domestic load research, studies typically use quite a variety of normalization algorithms, and it's not always well validated why they use the one over the other. So what we decided to do is to try to test 4 different normalization techniques against each other, as well as profiles with no normalization. So this slide is something that you can come back to at a later stage, but it shows how different forms of normalization really create different effects of load profiles when they apply to them. And again, it's important that because the data that you feed into your model, or your model is completely dependent on the data that you provide as input. So normalization is an important aspect to consider to make sure that your data can actually be processed by the algorithm in a sensible manner. Secondly, we looked at ways of pre-binning the energy, the daily load profile. So again, like we tested without pre-binning and with pre-binning, and thinking a bit how to best present this. So because clustering algorithms minimize the distance between, or form clusters based on minimizing or maximizing distance between points that are similar or different, having a data set with a huge variety or with a very large variety of data can be quite challenging, because you end up with exaggerated or potentially exaggerated distances. And what you might end up with then, let's say if you've got your very high consumer that uses 1,000 kilowatt hours per month and a low consumer using 10 kilowatt hours a month, a clustering algorithm typically would put the 1,000 kilowatt hour consumer into one cluster, and then could quite easily put all remaining consumers that are between 0 and 100 kilowatt hours into a separate cluster. But this will give you very little nuance over understanding the behavior on the end of the spectrum, where there are potentially more people, or more households, but households consuming energy in a closer range. So what pre-binning is about instead of using your entire data set as one data set, is breaking it up into pieces and effectively treating each of those pieces to an extent independently. So we tried 2 different approaches to pre-binning. The one was that we split the data set based on average monthly consumption. So households that had the same average monthly consumption, their load profiles were clustered together. And the second was an approach called integral kmeans, which looked at I guess it's a more complicated way of looking at an aggregation of consumption over a particular time period. So integral kmeans applies the kmeans algorithm twice. We first cluster all the profiles to find the most similar ones based on average consumption, and then we do a second clustering within that to actually group load profiles. Altogether, we ran 8 different experiments, and we tested 3 different algorithms. The first algorithm we tested is kmeans, which is a very standard, probably the most used algorithm for clustering. The second is self-organizing maps, abbreviated as SOM, which is a form of neural network that has been used by several other studies. And then the third is a combination of self-organizing maps and kmeans, where the self-organizing maps does a form of dimensionality reduction, and the kmeans then clusters a data set with reduced features. For each of the algorithms, we tested a variety of parameters. N corresponds to the number of clusters or the number of dimensions. D, the number of dimensions. And then for each parameter with each algorithm, we tried 5 different forms of normalization. So no normalization, unit norm, deminning, 0-1 normalization, and the South African norm, which is a normalization technique that was typically, or that has been used in South Africa. Then we tested two different forms of pre-binning, the average monthly consumption and the integral kmeans. And finally, we removed zero values from some of the experiments, but not from others. The rationale here is that zeros are typically removed because, again, they skew results because they make the computation of, they exaggerate the computation of distance measures. But because the data or the population represented in our data had such a variety of high and low income consumers and some very new consumers, we did not want to assume that zero values always represented, that zero values were always invalid. So we wanted to have the option that a household might have a zero consumption reading, not because their logger was faulty, but because they actually did not consume any energy in that period because they, for example, either chose not to because they ran out of money, or maybe because something was broken, like an appliance was broken in the house. So we tested both with the zeros and without zeros. The typical clustering output then that we got, let me just go back one slide. So I've highlighted here in yellow and in red two experiments that I'll continue making reference to as we go along. So what you see here is what was highlighted in yellow, experiment 5, kmeans normalized with 0, 1. And this is the clustering output that we got for that. These are the 18 representative daily load profiles that we got. You'll see that we've got cluster 9, which contains 800,000 profiles, so about a quarter of all the daily load profiles belong to cluster 9, which typically isn't particularly useful. And then you've got some other clusters that look like they've got hardly any because there's so few households that were associated with them. So that's probably cluster 17, 18. Those are those very high lines at the top. Those are then typically your outliers. If a line is that rugged, it means that it probably contains only a handful of load profiles, which we don't really want. Then on the other hand, we've got a second output, which is for experiment 8, kmeans unit norm. What you can see here is, again, that cluster 33 has got a large number of profiles. It's got about 450,000. And then for the remainder, the number of load profiles assigned to different clusters is equal. Sorry, just realized I should explain what the two graphs mean. What we have at the bottom is a bar chart that shows how many daily load profiles were assigned to each of the clusters. And what we have at the top is our set of representative daily load profiles for each cluster. So if we've got 59 clusters, there'd be 59 representative daily load profiles at the top. And it's hourly electricity demand, current demand in amperes from midnight to midnight. Okay, so between those two clusters, those were only 2 out of about 600 different sets of representative daily load profiles that we got out. And the big question is, how do we evaluate which ones of those we actually want to use? So clustering evaluation is absolutely important in order to decide which of these load profiles we actually want to use. Typically, the way that's done is through quantitative evaluation. However, as I demonstrated in the beginning, there are many different ways to cluster, and how you cluster really depends on the end use that you have. So instead of only having quantitative evaluation, we also added a qualitative evaluation process. If we go from left to right, from top to bottom, the clustering structures are evaluated with quantitative metrics. We combine 3, the Davis building index, silhouette index, mean index adequacy, and we use those to create a combined index and select our top 10 experiments. And at the same time, we then conducted expert interviews, developed competency questions that we weighted, and used these to construct qualitative evaluation measures that we combined in a cluster scoring matrix, which we used to re-rank the top 10 experiments and ultimately select our best experiment. Quick dive into clustering evaluation. So quantitative evaluation is typically concerned with creating clusters that are unusually compact and unusually distinct. I've shown what compact and distinctness relates to in the two pictures here. Compact means that individual points lie close together, whereas distinctness means that points in different clusters lie far apart. What unusual means, that is up to interpretation, and that is what makes cluster evaluation challenging. Evaluating our experiments on quantitative scores, you'll see that experiment 5, let me go back to that. It was these clusters here. So experiment 5 ranked second best in terms of all our experiments. And experiment 8, this one here, ranked, I think was 9th or 10th best, 9th best in terms of all our experiments, based on these computational ways of calculating goodness. However, I said that wasn't enough for us, and we elicited from experts, we elicited further information about what might make clusters good. And so ultimately, for a cluster to be useful, we said that the load shape must be possible to deduce the load shape from the clusters, that we want clusters that can distinguish between low, medium, and high consumption consumers. We wanted clusters to represent specific loading conditions for different day types and seasons. We wanted it to be possible to represent a zero consumption profile. And we wanted that the number of households assigned to clusters is reasonable given knowledge that we have of the sample population. So again, it's what we knew is that over half of the households within the data set consume less than 10 kilowatt hours per day. And so our expectation was that a large number of households would fall into low consuming clusters, and we wanted sufficient nuance within those clusters that we can actually distinguish between different types of behavior. So those questions were rolled up into measures that we can compute. And particularly, we used the concept of entropy to do that. So we defined two broad categories: whether clusters are usable and expressive, and then whether they're expressive and representative, expressive and homogeneous, and then created evaluation measures that related to the count of profiles per cluster, whether zero profile representation was possible, the error in consumption between our representative daily profile and the household, the individual daily load profiles within that cluster, and peak coincidence, so whether the peak time of our representative profile overlapped, to what extent that peak overlapped with the peak of the households in the cluster, and then temporal and demand entropy, so whether clusters were very unique to particular temporal and demand conditions, or whether they were used quite ad hoc. Looking at the qualitative scores then, and each of the scores was then weighted based on how important we deemed that measure to be. As a disclaimer, that weighting obviously has a massive impact on the actual results. So playing with that weighting can alter the results significantly. What we found after the qualitative evaluation is that our experiment 8 with k-means unit norm, which was only 9th best in the quantitative evaluation, actually was the best set of representative daily load profiles when we really considered where we wanted to use it. And experiment 5, which did really well in the quantitative evaluation, actually turned out to be very poor at giving us sufficient nuance to make the set of clusters really usable for us. A caveat is that even for a best set of clusters like experiment 8, the representative daily load profile at the end of the day is still only that, representative and an aggregation. So if we take here a sample of different clusters and then a random selection of daily load profiles assigned to that cluster, you can see that the red line, which represents the representative daily load profile, still has significant variance when plotting daily load profiles assigned to that cluster to it. And yeah, that's just important to remember, is that we're not dealing with absolutes, we're dealing with a representation and an aggregate. So, quick recap, where are we with load profile clustering? We spoke about the input data, we spoke about pre-processing, in particular we spoke about normalization and pre-binning. And what we found is that normalization with unit norm performs considerably better than all other normalizations, and pre-binning generally returns better results than no pre-binning. We looked at different algorithms for time series clustering, kmeans, self-organizing maps, and a combination of the two. Kmeans performed really well for our purposes, and it is fast in executing, which is an advantage. We went through quantitative evaluation metrics and found that they are useful in selecting the best, kind of the top set of clusters. However, they tend to, again, the clustering metrics, they only look at distinctness and compactness, and for us there were other features that were also important. So we created qualitative evaluation measures, and using those we were able to select the best set of clusters with far greater nuance. Now, towards customer archetypes, how do we use what we've just built to really get to this view of what a typical consumer might look like? We're almost done, and I won't go into that much detail about these two steps, because really once we've got a set of representative daily load profiles that we want to use, there are many different ways of combining them into archetypes. In particular, so what we've done with classification segmentation is we've taken our set of representative daily load profiles, and we use the survey data that we've got from the social demographic survey data to give each cluster particular characteristic attributes. We used multinomial logistic regression to do that, and that gives us then a model where each cluster has a probability of being used, like a likelihood of being used by households with particular dwelling or economic household member attributes. Once we had those, we then filtered the clusters based on how experts define particular archetypes. Let me quickly take you through it because it'll make more sense once you see it. So the input to classification, to the multinomial logistic regression classification, was to take, so the columns here represent individual households. What we'd have then is K is the cluster that we're speaking about. So we'd have, for example, a household with a ID 5396 with cluster K37, and that cluster would have been used 14 times by that household, which is what the weight is about. And then we'd assign to that household, to that cluster, and to that weight particular particular characteristics, like the season which it was used is winter, day type is weekday, province is KZN, adults is 2, children is why is it children 21 to 60? Oh, something must have shifted. Okay, I'd have one part-time employee. It would have monthly income of 24,500 to 65,000. No geysers, no Floria. Something seems really funny about this. I'll have to check it. But yeah, let me pause for a moment. Effectively, then we do that for each of the households, each of the clusters used by that household would then be weighted and socio-demographic attributes assigned to that household, to that cluster. And that would be that was then fed into a multinomial logistic regression algorithm, which provided a probability score of a cluster being used by household with particular attributes. How did we define what attributes are important? So in the past, archetypes have been created, and they've been created by taking observations of household, creating an impression of these households based on physical attributes, then creating a load class name for what those attributes represent, and ultimately assigning that load class back to the household, and then developing a class profile. So, for example, a rural archetype has in the past been defined as having river or borehole water access, having a thatched roof material, having a floor area of 0 to 50 square meters, and a mean income of 0 to 3,200 rand. Whereas urban rich would have a tap in the house, would have plaster and tiles as roof material, floor area of 250 to 800 square meters, and mean income over 65.5 thousand rands per month. And so we used these existing heuristics that have been used in the past for archetypes, and to try and reconstruct those. The way that actually works is, so here we've got, for one particular customer archetype, we've got the probability tables that were returned after multinomial logistic regression. In the left-hand columns, in the fields highlighted in yellow and blue, are the fields by which we filtered all the clusters. The top row, the 39, 45, 46, 49, 50, and 53, those are the clusters that correspond, or those are clusters, and we filtered all the clusters that aren't well suited. So, and then the way that we use these probability tables is that if the likelihood that a cluster was associated with a particular attribute was more than 1.1, we kept it. If it wasn't, we removed it. And so this now is a collection of all those clusters that have a likelihood of more than 1.1 of being associated with those attributes that are highlighted in yellow and in blue. And that finally then allowed us to construct our archetypes. So here, for example, we've got the same as we've got the archetypes for the consumer that we highlighted here. You'll see the 39, 45, 46, 49, 50, 53. Those are the profiles that we've got drawn out here. So this is a collection of representative daily load profiles for this consumer. And what we can see here again is we've got the clusters we've got different clusters for winter and for summer, which is good, which is what we expect. We've got different clusters for different day types. And what we've included in the bottom is a benchmark where we can compare this, our constructed archetype, with a benchmark that has been created previously. One thing that is important to remember, so for example, have got 3 different clusters that can be used on weekdays in winter, whereas the benchmark only had 1 representative daily load profile for winter weekday. And so while our maximum consumption is, for example, 2.5 amperes, and the benchmark is 1.4, once we average out the 3 clusters that we have over winter, we actually start getting profiles that are quite similar to what the benchmark was, which was quite encouraging. And this is just a second one as a different example. This is now an upper middle class archetype in KwaZulu-Natal. And in relation to the previous one, we can see that the morning peak, especially the morning peak in summer, is considerably earlier than in the previous one, and can see that the total consumption is also considerably higher. So we're getting the nuance that we hope for, that we hope for that we'd get between geographies and between economic groups. Now, an overall last recap of the framework. So what we showed with the work is that we can, given hourly load profile data and given socio-demographic data that we have to characterize the consumers, we can use load profile clustering to select or to create a set of representative daily load profiles that represents our consumers. We can then combine that set of representative daily load profiles with socio-demographic data to characterize those load profiles, and then use filter these characterized profiles based on attributes that are important to us to construct customer archetypes. And most of these steps can be automated, and making the overall creation of customer archetypes faster, more reproducible, and making assumptions more explicit. That's it from my side. Thanks a lot for attending and listening to this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm available to answer any questions that you might have. The research again was thanks to the DST Care Scholarship, which funded the research. The data set that we used was made available through funding from SAIEE, and then special thanks to Marcus Dierkenaar for providing expert insights. You can reach me at wiebketoussaint@gmail.com. My GitHub repository, which contains the code that I used to create the work, is my username is WiebkeT. Find me on Twitter. I like tweeting. And if you want to use the data, if you are doing academic research involving household energy consumption, you can find it on the Data First website. Thank you and enjoy your evening.